When I first heard that AUNE, and that's their pronunciation of their name, I asked them, had made a $700 Class A headphone amp, I was a bit skeptical, as sometimes manufacturers, what they say is Class A is really kind of just Class AB. But they assured me that yes, it is a genuine Class A amplifier and it gets hot enough to be one. So they offered to send me one for review, and so here it is. Now you're wondering what's the deal about Class A amplifiers. Most amplifiers are Class AB because they only use about half the total power fairly continuously. A Class A amp has 100% of the power passing through it 100% of the time. While it's switched on, thank you to the YouTube commentator who reminded me to say that, that means they get, well, quite warm and hot, but they can perform excellently versus a Class AB amp depending on how it's set up. Like most Class A amplifiers, it's solid state and it's also fully balanced internally, which I'll explain in a bit, but it means that you have a set of XLR inputs and RCA inputs, which we, as we refer to, single-ended. So if you have something like some of my favorite chord DACs, which are only single-ended output, you can still plug them into the single-ended inputs and you'll get a full advantage of the balanced architecture because it will be converted to balanced internally. You also, if you have something like a pair of active speakers or a power amp and want to use this as your preamplifier, you can do so via the XLR or RCA outputs on the back. If you're not sure how to hook everything up, I actually have done a video on how to hook up your system, which I'll put a card link to in the corner. You can check that out, and I explain how to hook up your DAC, your amp, and everything like that if you're one of those people who is new to head-fi and hi-fi. But otherwise, you just have a power connector on the back and a switch, and yeah, all the action happens on the front. Now, unlike the inputs, to get full advantage of the balanced architecture, you have to use the balanced outputs, that is the 4-pin XLR and the 4.4mm Pentacon. If you use the 6.3mm connector, well, it is only what's called single-ended, and for balanced, it needs at least 4 connectors, and the reason being that a balanced amplifier doesn't have just a left-hand amplifier and a right-hand amplifier, but has on the signal return inverted amplifiers, which kind of double the amplification, and that means you need the extra connector that the 6.3mm socket does not have. But most high-end and most quality headphones these days either come with the option or come with at least a 4-pin XLR connector, and many come with the 4.4mm Pentacon nowadays, so that's generally not an issue. Now, the volume control is digitally controlled analog volume internally, and that's because you have this funky remote. And this is probably the neatest remote I've ever seen, and probably the best one for losing in a room such as this with all this gear. I managed not to do it. And the cool thing about it, AUNE reads the same way, this way up, as it does upside down. You know, like the new Dune movie logo. But anyway, I wanted to mention that cool thing. Now it has this massive screen on the front, as you can see, and other than the volume control and the input which you can change by pressing the front, you have to control everything else via the remote. So if you lose this, you're going to, well, not be having a happy time. Now, like many amplifiers, it does have 2 gain levels, which you can switch there. You have an input select as required, and you also have, of course, the volume ramps up and down at a pretty reasonably quick speed, so for remote control, but not too fast and not too slow. One of the interesting things that you have is something called a bias adjustment. By pressing the second to top button, the display will change to slightly red in the surrounds, and you will see a figure down there go from 50 mA to 100 mA, which is the bias current for the transistors. Now I'm going to get out of the way that with all the headphones that I tried, I only noticed a very small difference in the sound of the amp in 50 milliamp mode and 100 milliamp mode, maybe with a slightly fuller sound from 100 milliamp mode, but it wasn't increasing the volume level at all, so I knew it wasn't that affecting my impressions. But in the end, it was kind of, well, the thing is, I'd honestly say that I think AUNE would have been better off not including the feature. And the reason was the drama over the feature early on. Now, early on, they had some firmware issues where the amp would get really too hot too quickly. And given there's no heatsink, other than internally on the top and the bottom, and there's not much space around the feet for air to flow, that was somewhat of a problem with it getting too hot and some people needing a firmware upgrade to have it not do that. Now that's all resolved now, unless I did something stupid like put it on a running HiFiMan Serenade like that, then it would get up to 60 degrees quite quickly. I didn't have any trouble with it getting over, about 40, 50 degrees, which is quite a reasonable and comfortable temperature. and it just ran fine in 100 milliamp mode. But if it does get too hot, the circuit in there will switch it back to 50 milliamp mode. The problem is sticking a temperature indicator on the front. A lot of people ended up just staring at the temperature indicator and talking about the temperature online, not about the sound of the amp, but the temperature. My temps were this, my temps were that, this thing got hot, this thing didn't get hot, I'm in this room at this temperature, blah, blah, blah. As a manufacturer, you want people talking about the sound quality, not the temperature. So I think they kind of shot themselves in the foot with that. If I were AUNE, I would have just chosen a bias current that I thought worked best, and then left it at that, and just ditched all that temperature indicator on the front, and maybe the unnecessarily big screen as well. Although if you are using it as a remote controlled preamplifier, I reckon the volume number level could have been bigger. That would have been a better use of this massive screen, because you can see how the 10 that's there is quite small relative to it. So yeah, maybe in a future design, that's my suggestion. Anyhow, probably the most important thing is how did it perform with headphones? Now, as a Class A amplifier, people tend to call them warm, and I wouldn't necessarily declare a amp as being warm unless it's tuned that way. And that probably, and I don't have measurements to back this up unfortunately because I don't have a measuring rig, probably comes down to how the crosstalk is arranged versus frequency inside an amplifier. Now this amplifier, they said it's tuned to something of a tube sound. Now I talk about tube sounds in another video, and that is my review of the Pavane Horizon series of tubes, and Pavane are sponsoring this video and some of my other videos, and I have done a review of their 6SN7 and 12AU7 Horizon tubes, which you can see by clicking on the card in the corner. They've designed a new range of tubes which are inexpensive but reliable tubes, considering a lot of new old stock tubes are starting to cost hundreds of dollars and sometimes really crazy money, especially if you're buying like an amp which takes multiple tubes. That can end up saving you a lot of money, and I compared them in my video, so do check that out. So thank you to Pavane for sponsoring my video. But in that I talk about how, well, tube sound can mean warm, or it can mean harmonic, or in the case of this, slightly V-shaped. So a little bit more bass, a little bit more treble. And that is good and bad in some ways. In the good way, it means that it makes things sound a little bit more exciting, a little bit more bass, a little bit more thump in there, but with very, clear and controlled sound from a high quality Class A amp. That's what you get. But a little bit of a sharper treble, well, that was a little bit hit and miss with some of the headphones I have. For most headphones, I've got the Mezes hiding behind me, even the Sennheisers, a lot of stuff in the rack back there. The finals up on the rack, Dan Clark Audio's headphones. Yeah, that worked out really, really well. But some brighter headphones, such as these Aria Organics I have in for review here, and even the Susvara Unveiled, well, they're already very brightly tuned, so adding more brightness was not a good match. In that, while I got that very kind of clear and controlled sound you do get from Class A, you get a little bit of excitement added, but the synergy wasn't always perfect. I also have Audeze's MM500s in for review. They are tuned as studio monitors, and also the headphone too, and they were also a good match with good driving capability, but again, adding that little bit of excitement, those worked out quite well. Speaking of things someone will have spotted by now, the Modhouse Tungsten, the headphone. I never thought I'd have a pair in for review. This actually is to go with the Enlium amp I just reviewed, and that will be coming up soon. These headphones, of course, require a speaker amp to drive, seriously, without doubt. However, you can drive them out of conventional headphone amplifiers, but the bass control won't be so perfect. It'll sound a little bit bloomy and out of control, much like trying to drive, say, a regular pair of planar headphones out of, say, a Schiit Audio Magni, one of the small amps. You get some kind of the same result, and it was much the same with the S17 as it was with most of these amps. It could do it, but you got that slightly bloomy bass versus if I use a speaker amp, whereas things were extremely well controlled. But for most stuff, even HiFiMan Susvara and the Susvara Unveiled and Dan Clark Audio's sometimes challenging to drive headphones, great results there. So you got that clean Class A sound, but with that slight coloration. In terms of clarity, I'd say that the S17 was a touch behind the Mjolnir. Now I plugged the Mjolnir and the S17 into the Chord TT2 and M scaler setup, which I use for evaluation. Now any head amp is going to be slightly less resolving than the TT2M scaler setup, but comparing both of them level matched with, well, a variety of headphones I have here, especially the Susvara Unveiled, I'd say some of the subtle nuances in the music didn't come through quite as clearly from the S17 Pro as the Mjolnir, and given the price differences between them, that sounds pretty reasonable. It revealed also the nature of the source it was plugged into, and hiding behind all this stuff, I still have the Gustard R26 here, which I tend to find to be somewhat of a mellow sounding DAC. And that mellow sound came through clearly through the S17. If I have a more exciting sounding DAC, something called TT2M scaler, I could definitely hear the qualities of the TT2 coming through. And likewise, the kind of slightly drier quality of, say, the Yggdrasil or maybe the Bifrost 264, I could make that out very well. Or even the little Modi multi-bit, which is hiding up there, probably just out of view. That was, you know, its qualities or lack of qualities were very clear as well. So apart from that slight amount of coloration, it's going to sound much like what the source is going to sound like, and it's going to drive headphones very well as well. So overall, if you want a good Class A headphone amp and you don't mind that it's going to get quite warm, then I'd say I'm going to recommend the S17, especially if you want an amp that sounds a little bit more entertaining than just neutral. However, if you want a completely uncolored amp, that may not be quite such a good match. But still, the design, apart from that maybe niggle of the causing a bit of anxiety over the heat, was pretty good, especially with this cool little remote control. While I had it here, it did perform flawlessly, so I don't have any particular concerns about that. I'd like to thank all my patrons and supporters who have been helping making these videos for years now, as well as Purvane for sponsoring, as because of them I've been able to do these reviews. So as always, thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you online.